This has been a rough week, so I think an appropriate topic for today would be cortisol. What is it? Why do we keep being told we need to reduce it? Did you know that if you don't have it, you'll die? Let's talk about cortisol. Okay, so first of all, cortisol is a steroid. No, not that kind of steroid, not anabolic androgenic steroid, but steroid as in it is synthesized from cholesterol pharmacologically. So what exactly does it do, and why does everyone keep telling us that it's so bad? I mean, the answer is simple, folks, and actually I should probably just do a short on this, but the simple answer is cortisol exists to liberate energy during a perceived fight or flight scenario. If you are not in a disease state, like you have Cushing's syndrome or adrenal tumors or something like that, if you're just a regular person and your cortisol is high, it's because you did something to make it high. It's a resultant condition. As in, you're under-recovered or extremely stressed out about something, or a combination of 2024 human behaviors that in a state of nature would be extremely deleterious to the survival of the organism. That's what cortisol is there to do. It's to provide you energy in those scenarios. That's why when you have a bad night's sleep, cortisol is high. That's also why, even if you had a good night's sleep, cortisol is still going to be higher when you wake up. Because if you happen to wake up in a cave after a good night's sleep, but there's like a saber-toothed tiger next to you, guess what? You gotta wake up real quick and like run or grab something and fight that thing. So cortisol is there high upon waking just in case you gotta do some fight or flight type stuff. And then it subsides after you eat breakfast. So the simple answer is cortisol exists so the brain and body have energy for emergencies. But what specifically does cortisol do? What are the mechanisms of action? Well, first and foremost, cortisol increases blood glucose concentration, so you can think of it as antagonistic to insulin. This is why people mistakenly assume that cortisol makes you fat. Cortisol doesn't make you fat, it increases blood glucose concentration, and then if you don't do anything with that increased blood glucose concentration, then it goes to the liver and then it becomes triglycerides. So it's not necessarily the cortisol, it's the cortisol and then the lack of emergency to use the increased blood glucose. Cortisol reduces our immune response, and you're like, oh, hold on, that's like even worse than fat gain, which it doesn't do. But just bear with me for a second here. It does this for a reason. The reason why your immune system gets downregulated is because high cortisol has a concomitant release of anti-inflammatory cytokines, specifically IL-10. And this is extremely useful in the case of, say for instance, you're a burn victim and you need a skin graft, right? Or you're in need of an organ transplant. Well, the biggest risk for you there is that your own immune system is going to reject the implant. It's going to reject the graft. When cortisol is high and IL-10 is secreted, your immune system is downregulated, and so you're more amenable to take the transplant, to take the graft. Not to mention, if you're in the middle of a fist fight with a saber-toothed tiger, it's probably a good thing to temporarily downregulate inflammation, and then you can deal with it later when you actually have time to rest and heal. I mean, you got to remember, folks, these mechanisms that we don't particularly enjoy as 2024 humans are baked into us from, eons of evolution for a reason. Now, here's the thing about cortisol, is everyone seems to demonize cortisol, but not necessarily for the right reasons or in the right way. So we already talked about cortisol being kind of necessary as a fight or flight emergency mechanism to liberate energy, downregulate inflammation, all these kinds of things. So the thing that we don't like about cortisol are like the downstream effects, the outcomes. We don't think of what input we created as 2024 humans to cause the reaction of high cortisol so that we get these negative downstream effects, right? We don't really think about that before we demonize it. We're just like, oh, cortisol is the problem. Well, cortisol is the result of something that we did. Like, pull an all-nighter to study for a test that we should have been studying for like months in advance, right? The other thing that cortisol is unfairly demonized for is the acute spikes. And what do I mean by that? We look at, for instance, the spike in cortisol upon waking, and we're like, oh, cortisol's high in the morning, we need to suppress cortisol. Well, now hold on a minute. I already explained why that is the case, but the other thing is that acute spikes of a seemingly deleterious substance that we make naturally, that's not really a problem. In fact, that's there for a reason, like we've already established. It's chronic dysregulation of cortisol. It's like having that chronic, like slightly elevated level of cortisol that over time is actually very, very problematic. And that's the thing that most people overlook when they demonize it. They want to shut down these short little brief spikes. Well, if that's the case, then eat better, sleep better, take better care of yourself, and your acute spikes in cortisol won't be so high, other than actual fight or flight scenarios. But the thing that you have to realize about cortisol, folks, is that cortisol sends a signal cascade and it acts transcriptionally to DNA, meaning that the actual kind of long-term deleterious effects of cortisol don't take place unless it hangs out for a while. It's one of those things where really the duration of the signal is more important than the amplitude of the signal, if that makes sense. There's a study that's often cited. I know Lane Norton has cited this a couple times, done by Stu Phillips and Daniel West in 2012. So in this study, what they were trying to determine is what specifically happens to various hormones during exercise stress. So like testosterone, IGF-1, like these kinds of things, right? Well, counterintuitively, while testosterone and IGF-1 went up, it was the elevated GH and cortisol levels that were more correlative to an increased cross-sectional area of type 2 fibers. In other words, in their words, this data correlates post-exercise hormone elevations with training adaptations. Did you trigger a growth response? If your cortisol is elevated, you probably did. So remember, folks, cortisol is a response to a perceived threat scenario, and acute elevations of cortisol are not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, oftentimes, they're exactly what you needed, even though you didn't realize you needed it. It's the chronic, long-term elevations of cortisol from poor lifestyle choices that are really the thing that can negatively impact our health. And of course, like most things, the biggest non-pharmaceutical levers you have to combat this are going to be stress management, sleep hygiene, good nutrition, and stimulative training. Check all those boxes and you can manage your cortisol so it doesn't manage you. Consistency is a superpower. Stay in the fight. Thanks for watching.